Difficulty as a concept can be hard to understand. We can say something is easy or hard, but understanding what makes it so is key to creating effective games. So how can we define difficulty and use it to enhance our designs? Let's talk about it today on Draw 5 Move 5. Hey everyone, and welcome to the table. My name is Gabe, and this is Draw 5 Move 5, a show where we draw connections between the mechanics behind our favorite games. Hollow Knight is a game of epic adventure on a small scale. A kingdom of bugs that has fallen into ruin, a storied past full of legendary creatures and powerful monarchs, and a knight's journey to explore it and eventually save it. But most bugs seem unaware of this higher role, even himself. Despite the concept's expected scale, the map is expansive and enjoyable, aesthetically pleasing, and full of lore, as are most of the enemies. One of the things that makes the game so fun, however, is its difficulty. While the beginning areas aren't too tough and introduce players to the basic concepts of exploration and fighting, as the player unlocks new abilities and, by extension, areas, the game can get very challenging very quickly, especially since many of the abilities are optional for completing the game, and the more the player has, the easier their experience may be. The acid swimming ability is a great example of this. While completing the game is possible without it, unlocking it lets the player travel more easily and opens them to choosing the order of certain events, such as fighting 3 dreamers later in the game in a different order. Is this optional progression the only thing that makes Hollow Knight difficult? Well, no, not really. Hollow Knight actually nails 3 key factors that we can use to define difficulty: complexity, skill, and danger. Complexity is a bit broad, but it basically refers to how many moving parts something has. The more things there are for a player to deal with at once, the more complex and, by extension, difficult. Skill is based more on the player and what the game asks of them. It is not only the player's physical ability, such as pressing buttons or making tactical decisions, but how well they're understanding what the game has taught them, how well they're absorbing the concepts. And danger describes the risk the game is posing to the player. Are there only a few platforms of safety where the rest of the land is covered in spikes, or does the boss hit for a much harder amount than its underlings? To illustrate what I mean, let's take a look at 2 bosses from the Hollow Knight game, the game's first boss, the False Knight, and a boss for around the middle of the game, the Broken Vessel. False Knight is a large, hulking brute. The player needs to damage it several times before it falls over, and the true creature within the armor, a maggot, is revealed and can be damaged. The False Knight has several attacks, including a leap, mace hit, and a slam that causes shockwaves the player needs to avoid. As the fight goes on, projectiles start to fall from the ceiling with some of these attacks, and a new attack is later introduced where the False Knight stands in the center of the arena and slams his mace over and over on the ground, causing many projectiles to fall. Breaking this fight down, we can see that this encounter isn't too difficult, especially since it's really the first boss of the game that you're likely to encounter. While the False Knight has a few attacks, it's not that many compared to some of the other bosses in the game, and most of his movements are simple. As a result, he's not very complex. There's not much skill required to defeat him. Simply dodging attacks and hitting him while he recovers from them, since his movements are fairly slow due to his large size, is the main game plan. The player may still be getting used to the controls, considering his boss is the first they're likely to encounter, but the patterns are slow enough and have large enough tells that the player should be able to parse out what's going on and avoid the danger. And speaking of danger is one point where this boss is a bit difficult. While False Knight hits for only 1 health with each attack, the game's primary healing mechanic is much harder to use in this fight. In order to heal, the player must expend Soul, a resource that can be gained by damaging enemies. The False Knight only grants Soul, however, when the player is hitting the maggot head that pops out when the knight is stunned after enough attacks. This means there are far less chances to heal, as Soul is more scarce. Overall, while this increases the difficulty a bit, it's a fair challenge for first-time players. This boss isn't especially difficult overall. The Broken Vessel is the husk of a knight, similar to the player, but it is possessed by infection that forces it to fight. This fight can be somewhere in the middle of the game depending on the choices a player makes, but behind it sits one of the best movement upgrades available, and which is basically required to beat the game: the Monarch Wings, or Double Jump. Compared to the False Knight, the Broken Vessel is a fairly difficult boss. What makes the difference? Firstly, this fight is far more complex. The vessel has around 6 attacks and variations to its abilities, making it difficult to follow what's exactly happening at any given time. In addition, one of the vessel's attacks spawns a minion, a floating ghost of infection that flies towards the player while the vessel continues about its day. We'll talk more on this later, but in general, introducing more enemies in an encounter to overwhelm the player will make a fight much harder. In the skill department, this boss is very tricky. The vessel's movements are erratic, and the tails for many of its attacks are similar to one another. Its in-air horizontal slash starts the same as its leap and slam attacks, challenging the player to try and find the subtle differences if they want to avoid them correctly, or just flounder around and hope they don't get hit. On top of this, a variety of the vessel's attacks cover most of the screen, either with its movement or the orange blobs of infection it produces. This demands a lot of the player to dodge and jump around these attacks, provided they've even figured out which one is coming at them. And third, this fight has a much higher sense of danger than the False Knight fight. While the Broken Vessel doesn't technically hit harder than the False Knight, due to the way its projectile attack works, the player is far more likely to get hit. Similar to the False Knight, after enough hits the vessel will be stunned, which in this case gives the player a chance to heal. But if a player doesn't notice this as they keep attacking, the stun breaks and they lose this opportunity. With all the projectiles flying around and the vessel's slashes covering 75% of the screen per attack, finding the time to heal is a true challenge, as doing so takes a moment and locks the player in place, leaving them vulnerable. Additionally, the vessel is fast, which makes avoiding it even harder. The False Knight was slow enough to be easily avoided, but this is certainly not the case for the Broken Vessel. All of this creates a dangerous fight, where health can be depleted very quickly, various moving parts and variations increase the difficulty, and a demand on the player's skills to use what they've learned and pick up what information they can about the fight quickly if they wish to succeed. This is a difficult boss. This breakdown of difficulty can apply to other gaming genres, as is the case with a lot of our discussions here on Draw 5 Move 5. In Dungeons & Dragons, designing combat encounters is a prominent part of being a dungeon master. Combat takes up a good portion of the game, and challenging the players is important for their enjoyment. While challenge rating, or CR, is designed to give DMs a benchmark to understand how tough a monster will be for the players, it can't account for everything. For D&D especially, the facet of complexity is what really makes a tough encounter. A party of 4 players could encounter one big bad, perhaps a young dragon, but manage to fight their way through the encounter because it's only one villain. Even with many options available to it, the dragon would likely be overrun by the players because they have more actions available to them. This is the concept of action economy, something that is incredibly important in encounter design not just for D&D, but for many other games. By granting the big bad legendary actions, abilities they can use within a limit, at the end of other players' turns, suddenly the dragon may have the same number of actions as the players, making the fight tougher. Comparatively, if 4 players walk into a warren of kobolds, where they could be up to 30 or so of them setting traps, throwing rocks, and generally chipping away at the player's health, with good tactics, these weak creatures could easily do in a party of stronger adventurers with their sheer numbers alone. Each kobold gets an action, and a bonus action, and when the number of enemy actions outnumbers the actions of the players, the fight becomes far more difficult. We see the same thing happened in the Broken Vessel boss fight. By introducing these ghostly orbs of infection that chase the player around the screen unless dealt with, it draws their attention away from the main boss and overwhelms them with the amount of enemies to fight. This attack is almost like a legendary action in D&D, allowing the vessel to attack even while it's doing something else. While difficulty can be hard to define, breaking it down into complexity, skill, and danger can make the job of defining why something is difficult easier. Our examples had a combat focus, but these ideas can apply to all aspects of game design. Using this to engineer our own encounters and games can make for great designs that will challenge our players. Although how much we want to challenge our players is a discussion for next time. Thank you so much for watching. You have my humble and eternal gratitude. What did you think of the conversation? Is this a good way to break down difficulty? And how does this apply to the games you play? I know I can see applications beyond combat to ensure that the game's rules don't get too bloated or difficult to understand. I'd love to hear your thoughts though, so let's keep this discussion rolling down in the comments. If you enjoyed the conversation and you want to hear more from me, subscribe and dingling that notification bell so you never miss an update. I'm putting out new videos every other week on games and gaming mechanics, and dropping a like lets me know you want to see more. My name's Gabe, this is Draw 5 Move 5, and until next time, go have a good game.